In the UK, euthanasia and assisted suicide are not permitted. But in the media, you hear a lot about people who travel to Switzerland to the Dignitas clinic where they can have that. But in 2023, 23 people choose to do that. That is, I think, a surprisingly low number. And again, I think often in the press, you get the idea there's lots of people with terminal illness who are desperate to have euthanasia and they're forced to carry on living when they don't want to. And there are a few, but that number is small, and that number is very small compared with the number of people who are committing suicide. And so one of my concerns is that in our debates around end-of-life issues, suicidality, that so much time and effort is spent upon a relatively small group of people facing horrific circumstances, but those and the difficult issues surrounding those have meant that we've lost sight of actually the far bigger problem of suicide amongst younger people, people who haven't got any kind of terminal illness. And I think part of this reflects a false image of suicide. And I think there are two images of suicide which are prevalent. First is particularly prevalent in a book by Kevin Yule called Assisted Suicide, the Liberal Humanist Case Against Liberalisation of the Law. And he is opposed to having a law which allows euthanasia or assisted dying because he believes that will regulate suicide. The law will come to govern suicide when he thinks, in fact, suicide should be, quote, should be profound and meaningful. He talks about it being the most human of human actions. And so he concludes his book by saying, rather than liberalizing the law on assisted suicide and euthanasia, we should just make it much easier for people to commit suicide. So we should make large amounts of tablets available, medication someone can take available, so that they can commit suicide. But at the heart of his book is this claim that suicide is a profound and meaningful decision. And he gives some examples. He gives an example of a Buddhist monk who sets fire to himself as a form of a political protest. Someone who was so humiliated, someone who had been caught with child pornography and killed themselves to save their family the embarrassment of a trial. And he sees these as decisions that someone has made which are profound and meaningful for them to express something, a great remorse, or to make a political point. And the law should not try and restrict that. But that image of the suicide being some deep, profoundly thought through decision is occasionally true, but very, very rare, as we'll see in a moment. So I think that image of suicide being some deep philosophical statement is a false one. The other powerful image is of suicide being a medicalized problem. Suicide, it's commonly thought, is a display of mental illness. There's nothing we can do about it. Somebody's seriously mentally ill and they've decided to commit suicide. And therefore it's a manifestation of their illness. That too, I suggest, is incorrect. Many people, also very few people with mental illness do go on to commit suicide. And in fact, the rates of suicidality amongst mental illness are perhaps slightly higher than the average person, but certainly not significantly higher. So here are a much more realistic examples taken from the UK of suicides that occur. A young teacher who killed herself because she thought it was a failure when she couldn't get jobs in the teaching profession. Suicide rates amongst middle-aged men in particular, as I've said. Young people affected by acne and exam stress are a leading cause of suicide, a study found. And tragically, a student who killed herself after wrongly being told that she had failed exams. Now, these sorts of examples, this is not some profound, meaningful statement that someone's being made. This is not even someone beset by mental illness in most of these cases. These are just individual tragedies where someone suddenly, at a particular moment of crisis, often impulsively, sought suicide. So we must have, I think, when we are approaching how the law should respond to suicide, to have in mind the actual kinds of cases which are your typical suicide, and it would be more cases of this kind. So I'm going to start by going through the legal response on this issue before moving on to looking at some of the more ethical and philosophical issues. So first of all, then, looking at the legal basis. Now, I'm sure you're very familiar with this, but just to be clear of the nature of this claim, that there is a human right to be protected from committing suicide. So clearly, this is a positive right in the sense that it's a right that requires the state to actively do something. So many of the rights we'll be familiar with are all about the state keeping away, the state not intervening. So the right to privacy normally requires the state simply to stay away. This, on the other hand, is a positive right. The state is being required to actively intervene to protect somebody. Also, as you'll be very familiar, there are some rights which are absolute and some rights which are defeasible. I'll come back to that in a minute because that's not quite clear in this case. There are some rights which are universal, are available to everybody, some rights which are only available to a particular group. And again, that's an issue I'll need to return to. But to introduce this right, let me give you the facts of an English case, but which very much relied upon the European Convention of Human Rights. It's a case called Rabone and Pennine NHS Trust. Ms. Rabone was generally a very happy woman. She was married, she had children, she had a successful career, she enjoyed life, had lots of hobbies, but was subject to moments of very intense depression. And often they're required to go to hospital, and she would then receive treatment and then get better. Often in these moments of intense depression, she would be suicidal and indeed be actively seeking to kill herself. And the hospital would normally restrain her to stop her from doing that. And each time she left the hospital, she expressed enormous gratitude to the staff for caring for her during these times. Importantly, the court noted that it wouldn't be correct to say in these moments of depression that she lacked mental capacity. She did understand her situation. She was able to make decisions. It was just she was suffering from a deep depression. On the particular question, on the particular issue, particular events which led to the case, tragically, she had another moment of intense depression, was taken to hospital, and this time the hospital failed to provide any kind of supervision. They didn't check on her. She left the hospital and just walked out. Nobody stopped her, and tragically, she killed herself. The UK Supreme Court found that that was a clear breach of her human rights. She had a right to be protected from committing suicide. The state and the state hospital had failed to put in place reasonable measures that could have protected her from committing suicide. So that's the kind of right that we're looking at, a case where the state could have put in place mechanisms, could have prevented someone from committing suicide, and yet failed to do so. The leading case, and forgive my pronunciation, is de Oliveira and Portugal. And this set out 4 elements of the right to protection from suicide. These, of course, all flow from Article 2, the right of life. So first of all, it was explained there is a universal general duty, and that is the general duty on the state to have in place general legal and administrative systems to protect people generally from suicide. So this isn't a duty that's so necessary to a particular person. It's just an obligation upon the state to have in place mechanisms that will protect from suicide. Secondly, there may be, in addition to that, specific general duties owed to particular groups. So if it's known there is a group of people who are likely to commit suicide, for example, prisoners, then there is then a duty on the state, as well as its general policies to try and prevent suicide, there might then be additional obligations to a particular identified group. Thirdly, and this is the one that I'll be focusing on particular, there may be a duty of the state in relation to a particular individual. So where the state is aware that a particular individual might commit suicide and the state can reasonably take steps to prevent them and doesn't, then that can breach their Article 2 rights. That was the case in the Rabone decision. Fourthly, there is a duty to investigate suicides, particularly to see if lessons can be learned to make sure that those are not repeated. I'm going to primarily focus on the first and third of those. So first of all, in relation to this general duty, there is, as the European Court confirmed in Hessen, Germany, a duty to ensure that the law itself protects people from committing suicide. And so in the Haas case, they were considering the law which allowed assisted dying, and said that any law which allows assisted dying or euthanasia must have in place mechanisms to ensure that people who are vulnerable, who are not acting in a fully autonomous way, are protected from suicide when it's not explicitly their choice. So the way they expressed it in Hessen, Germany, and we'll come back to this later, there's a balance that needs to be done in the legislative regime between protecting people's right to life under Article 2, but also protecting people's right to privacy and free choice under Article 8. So it's embedded within that general response to the assisted dying debate that we must be protecting people from using assisted dying when it's not fully an autonomous decision of theirs. Similarly, the issue was raised in the Catalonian and Finland case in relation to gun control, that the state had to have in place a protection for gun control that made sure people didn't use guns as part of assisted, didn't use guns to commit suicide. So again, there's a duty on the state in its general legislative regime. It also seems there's a duty to have a general administrative protection as well. There needs to be something like a suicide prevention policy to try and discourage suicide generally within the population. So what about the particular general duty? Well, that applies, as I said, to groups of people. So a common example is in relation to hospitals, particularly where there are patients within the hospital who may be feeling suicidal. And again, there's a duty on the hospital to have in place policies that suicidal people within their population will be protected. What, though, about the individual case, a case more like Rabone, where there's someone in the hospital where the state is under a duty to protect them? The first requirement that needs to be shown is that there must be a real and immediate risk of suicide. So again, the Oliveira case, the court found that the positive obligation arose when the authorities knew or ought to have known that the person posed a real and immediate risk of suicide. So this is a really important limitation upon the right, where the state did not know or could not have known that the person was at risk of suicide, then the duty doesn't arise. So, of course, it was crucial in the Rabone case, for example, that she was in the state hospital, she had a history of suicidal attempts, and therefore, and they were aware that she was feeling suicidal at the time, and therefore the obligation arose. Where there is quite some debate in the law, where there's some uncertainty in the law, is whether or not those cases of real and immediate risk only apply to those who are in some sense in the care of the state. So most of the cases where a successful claim has been brought under Article 2 have indeed been those where someone who is in some sense in the care of the state. So I've listed there the four groups where successful claims have so far been heard in the European Court of Human Rights, cases involving prisoners or immigration detention centres, where someone's actually being detained by the state, those who are in hospital receiving psychiatric care, those who have been conscripted into military service, and those receiving voluntary care in a psychiatric hospital. Now, the question which arises is it that the right can only arise in those kind of cases? Those have been the ones that so far have arisen. Or are those just cases where it's particularly likely that the state will know that someone is at risk of committing suicide and can reasonably do something to protect them? So in other words, if it's somebody who's just in their house or in their flat feeling suicidal, the state may well not know that of their condition, and it may not be easy for the state to do anything to stop them from committing suicide. Now, there are some commentators who have taken the view that it has to be, this right is only restricted to those who are actually in the care of the state. Now, I'm not convinced myself that that is correct. Certainly, we've got one case, the case concerning Azerbaijan, the Mammadov case, where the right was applied outside that kind of setting. So in this case, the police had come to evict a woman from a state-owned flat. She was extremely distressed at being evicted. Indeed, it became clear that she had become utterly overwhelmed and started making indications that she would commit suicide. The police stood back, did nothing. Indeed, she did tragically go on to commit suicide. And it was held even there, although she wasn't directly in the care of the state, she was in her flat. The police could see that she was feeling suicidal. They could have taken steps to protect her and didn't. So I think we've already got one case there which shows that this right isn't limited to cases where there is someone is in the care of the state. And indeed, that seems to have been the position taken particularly by Baroness Hale in the English case in Rabone, where she took the view, and I think this is the correct one, that being in the care of the state is very likely to mean the state will be aware, or at least ought to have been aware, of the suicide. That means it's very likely that there were reasonable steps that could be taken. But that's not to say if someone is not in the care of the state, the right doesn't arise at all. And certainly that seems to be right to me as a point of principle. If we're talking about somebody's right to life, and do you have a right to be protected, that right should exist wherever you are, whether you're in the care of the state or not. That if you like, being in the care of the state is relevant to the nature of the duty that's also the nature of the duty the state has, but shouldn't affect the existence of the right. So I think the correct way to analyze this is that everyone who is feeling suicidal has the right to be protected. It's just that in many cases, the state wouldn't know that was happening, or there was nothing the state could do. The second difficult issue surrounds what the state can reasonably do. So we've reached the position then that the state has a duty to take steps to protect someone, but that those steps only need to be reasonable. And as Lady Hale explained in the Rabone case, there's a difficult balance between the right of the individual to freedom and self-determination and the right to be prevented from taking own life. As they put it in the De Oliveira case, you have to ask what the state could reasonably have been expected to do. So here there seems to be an acceptance that there comes a point where the intervention that would be required, perhaps the amount of force that might be needed to prevent someone from committing suicide, would become so great if someone has to be physically restrained, tied down, locked up for long periods, that their rights under Article 8 and I suppose even Article 3 might make it unreasonable for the state to do that. So in the Rabone case, they were quite clear that she should have been prevented from leaving the hospital, that mild restraint could have been used. But as Baroness Hale accepted, there seemed to be a point where very serious physical force needing to be used. It might be at that point, Article 8 and perhaps Article 3 rights will trump the Article 2 rights. But we haven't got a lot of guidance yet from the court on that. In the very recent case of Muller and Spain, they were looking at this balance between the Article 8 right to respect for private life and the Article 2 right, right to protection for life, in relation to regulation over euthanasia and assisted dying. And I think looking at the middle of this quote, they note that there is a balance between the duties under Article 8 and Article 2, but they do then say, the court reiterates that the right to life ranks as one of the most important fundamental provisions in the Convention, and also enshrines one of the most basic values of the democratic societies making up the Council of Europe. It requires the state, as we've seen, not only to refrain from intentional taking of life, but to take appropriate steps to safeguard the lives of those within its jurisdiction. So I wonder here whether the talk about the right to life being one of the most fundamental provisions and one of the most basic values suggests that where there is a balance, Article 2 perhaps is going to hold the greater weight. And so only if it's really going to interfere in a very profound way with Article 8 rights or Article 3 rights will it be found to be unreasonable. We might just step back as a moment from theory and ask, well, why should the state be under an obligation to intervene in suicide? Is it not, if you like, just a private matter? It's an individual choice. Someone has felt their life's not worth living. Why do we think the state should be under a duty to intervene? Well, I think, first of all, as a matter of the right to health. Mental illness is one of the reasons that's commonly related to suicide. And if we think that treatment intervention is part of the right to health, then part of the good part of the right to receive good treatment for mental ill health should include the right to protection from suicide. So one way of seeing the Rabone case is a breach of her right to health. Secondly, and I'll be coming on to this in the second part of the lecture, I think actually protecting people from suicide is respecting their autonomy. Thirdly, and this is one I want to talk about a little bit more, is that in fact I think the state bears a large responsibility for suicides. So the idea that suicide is a private matter, that it tells us something about the turmoil a particular individual is going through, is partly true, but is only part of the picture. That suicides tell us a lot about the nature of our society, the nature of our culture. The number of suicides amongst our young people must ask us, what is it about our society? What is it about childhood today? What is it about student life, which is leading to these horrifically high suicide rates? And to say, oh, it's just a private issue, it's a sort of series of tragedies, is overlooking the role of social media, suicide sites online, pressures upon young people generally. And so the state has a role to play. So I want to give one example of that. There's been increasing concern in the UK over suicide rates amongst those who are receiving benefits for unemployment or disability benefits. And we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years, with increased cutbacks in the UK for benefits, increasing rates of suicide. And these have been called by one commentator, deaths of despair. So here are just three tragic examples. Mr. Slater, who lost unemployment and support benefits due to his blindness and agoraphobia. He was assessed and found fit to work. He told he must go and get a job. There was no reason why he should be dependent upon benefits. Just after that assessment, he killed himself. Ms. Pardo, who jumped off a balcony with her baby when she was told that her allowance was going to be stopped. And similarly, after someone who's called in for a meeting was so worried that she was going to have her benefits cut that she again killed herself. These cases all seem to have been provoked in some sense by the lack of compassion from the state, the difficulty people have in accessing advice and help, the apparent lack of understanding of the impact of disabilities. And so I think these are a particularly profound example of the way that the state has a responsibility for suicide rates. And we can see this in other contexts as well. There was a big report out in the UK recently on the number of suicides which are connected with domestic abuse. And a shocking number of women committing suicide had recently escaped from abusive relationships. And again, I think they're simply to say, oh, well, that's just a private tragedy or their mental ill health, is not to recognize it's the state's failure to respond effectively to domestic abuse which is causing that. We have high rates, as I've already mentioned, of middle-aged men committing suicide. And again, some commentators have linked that to a crisis of masculinity. If a man loses his job, can't support his family, he feels he hasn't got a role in society. Men, it's said sometimes, not being good at expressing their feelings, all of those kinds of issues. But these are all tied up with societal concerns. Higher rates of suicide amongst those in the LGBT community. And again, concerns there that societal attitudes are contributing. So I think we need to move beyond this idea that suicide is just a medical issue or a private tragedy to recognize it's saying something about our society. The way our society is structured is pushing people towards suicide. And that's why it's particularly legitimate and appropriate that we put the obligation on the state. They've helped create some of these circumstances in which people a push to suicide, and therefore it's right that they should be expected to take reasonable steps to prevent people committing suicide. So moving now on to the ethical issues. The debates around the ethics of suicide have for a long time been dominated by religious concerns, that committing suicide was a sin, or the idea of sanctity of life. But nowadays, it tends to be issues around autonomy. That if somebody wants to commit suicide, other people shouldn't be stopping them from committing suicide. It's their own private decision. So this idea of autonomy, that each person should be able to live their life as they wish. You might not like the decisions I make, but you have no right to interfere and stop me doing those things. I like to eat gooseberry yogurt. You might think that's a terrible thing to eat, but you shouldn't be stopping me eating my favorite kind of yogurt. That's my choice, not one you should interfere, you should seek to stop. And that's because each person should be entitled to write their own story of the good life. They should live the life that they want to lead, rather than other people telling them what to do. But I think we need to beware of two things in relation to that. First of all, most commentators accept that autonomy comes in a scale, so that the extent to which we're in a position to make decisions about our lives, the extent to which we have the capacity to decide how to live our lives, varies. Sometimes someone might be fully informed about the decision, be free from outside influence, and be able to make an informed decision about where they want their life to go. But other times people are making a decision based on some of the facts under pressure. It might still fall within autonomy, but it might be a weaker kind of autonomy. So I think the weight we attach to autonomy must vary on the extent to which the decision is richly autonomous. So how informed was somebody? How much scope did they have to reflect upon the decision? And that's especially important when we come in the context of really important decisions, like someone ending their life. So that if autonomy is going to justify allowing someone to take their life, it has to be at that richer end of autonomy, a decision which is properly informed, which is free from outside influence, that they've had a decision to think through for themselves. Only then might it be sufficiently rich to make a fully autonomous decision. So let's have a little look more at this idea of capacity, having capacity or having the ability to make an autonomous decision. The first point I'd make is that in the English Mental Capacity Act, it explains that a person is not to be treated as unable to make a decision merely because it's an unwise decision. So clearly that's saying that just because you might think someone's making a bad decision doesn't mean you can interfere with it. But that does not mean that you can't take into account the wisdom of the decision, and particularly the word merely in that section. That's simply saying that's one of the factors you can, that you can't base the decision that someone lacks capacity just on the fact that it's an unwise decision. But it can be one factor to take into account. Why is this person making such a foolish decision? Is this because they aren't aware of all the information? Or they're not being able to think rationally? Or they're being influenced by others inappropriately? So I think we can start quite legitimately with a conclusion, well, if somebody's wanting to kill themselves, that may well be because they lack capacity, that they're mistaken about the circumstances. Now, you can't jump, I think, straight away from a conclusion that because they're suicidal, they lack capacity, but it is one legitimate factor. So I will claim that nearly all people who are seeking to commit suicide are lacking capacity, certainly in this rich sense. First of all, because many of them are simply mistaken as to the facts. Many letters that express suicidality cover two particular themes. One is essentially nobody loves me. And second is I've got no valuable future. There's nothing good for me ahead. That is nearly always untrue. That it's clear on their death, many people did love that person. That, yes, they've just lost their job. It might seem that there's no future, but there is really. So we know the lovesick teenager whose first love has just ended may well feel, I'll never fall in love again. It's all hopeless. But we know that's not true, or very unlikely to be true, that they will find someone else to love. And so many suicides are just based on a misunderstanding of what the facts are. And even in cases involving serious illness. So there have been quite a few studies now on people who are informed they have an awful progressive illness. They have cancer or motor neuron disease. And the rates of suicidality initially are quite high, but those dramatically fall off within the weeks ahead. When someone finds actually there are things that they've still got to live for. There are still good values. But yes, at the moment it might seem bad. So many expressions of suicidality are based on an error of fact. Secondly, many, I believe, are not the result of a sufficiently thought through decision. Many of them are impulsive. So in the biggest study on this found that 40% of suicides, the person had been thinking of suicide for 5 minutes or less. So they'd suddenly had some dramatic bit of news. They suddenly felt awful. And they just, in a moment of instinct, a moment of impulsivity. Over 83% of the suicides were described as impulsive. This was not something someone had been thinking about for weeks and weeks and weeks and had finally reached a settled decision. That is not actually the typical suicide. So again, I think many people lack that ability to weigh up the issue, that it's a properly, richly thought through decision. I'm not saying it can't be, I'm just saying it rarely is. To be a properly autonomous decision, it has to be one that is self-determined. In other words, that it's a choice that you are making that is not being imposed upon you. So I think we'd all accept if someone was told, you must sign this contract or else you'll be shot, that they would not then be acting freely if they signed the contract, because the alternative was going to be death. They were faced with two terrible alternatives, signing a contract they didn't want or being shot. And that wouldn't be a genuine decision of self-determination if they did that. But that's sort of what many suicides are like. Someone feels the future is absolutely awful, or they've got to kill themselves. So the alternatives they're facing don't give scope for a free choice. Joseph Raz talks about this in his discussion of autonomy. He gives the example of a man who is in the bottom of a pit, and he can take one step forward and one step back, but the pit's a very narrow hole. Now, in a sense, he's got a choice. He can choose whether to step forwards or step backwards. But Raz says that's no genuine autonomy there. The other example he gives of a woman who is pursued by a bear around an island. Now, she does have choice. She can run to the beach, she can run to the woods, she can run to the mountains, but she's always trying to escape from the bear. So it's not a meaningful choice. The options are not between meaningful alternatives. And again, so it is, I think, often in the case of suicide. Finally, to be autonomous, we need to be self-governing. We need to make choices that reflect our values, that they are values that we have chosen for ourselves and we want to live by. But again, reports from suicide notes suggest for many people, they feel they're worthless, that their life has no value, and that they're not using values that they've adopted for themselves. And therefore, it's not truly self-governing. So I argue in my book then that actually if we're interested in autonomy, we're interested in respecting people's wishes, actually in the vast majority of cases, we should be stopping people committing suicide, because that is actually what many people want. So the vast majority of cases where someone has stopped committing suicide, they are enormously grateful. The vast majority of people who attempt suicide do not repeat it. So these are indicating this is a moment of despair, a momentary wish, but it's not reflecting a longer-term desire that they're having. So if we go back to Ms. Rabone's case, yes, at the moment of her intense depression, she was wanting suicide, but we know that most of the time she really enjoyed life. And we know that when she was stopped committing suicide, she was really grateful. So if we want to respect Ms. Rabone's autonomy, who do we listen to? The Ms. Rabone in the depths of despair, or the Ms. Rabone when she's well and she's healthy and happy? And we are I think we should be listening to her, the normal Ms. Rabone, who is happy and well. And we're disrespecting her autonomy if we're listening to her at her moment of deep, deep despair. So can we do anything? So if we do take the view that the state should be doing something, can we? And we certainly can. So there is a remarkable variance in suicide rates within the United States, and in 92% variation. And it is almost entirely linked to the availability of guns. So those states with a large number of guns, ready availability to guns, will have much higher suicide rates than those who don't. Now, that shows two things. First of all, again, that suggests that whether someone commits suicide or not in the United States is often dependent on the gun regulation in their state. It's clearly not a deeply settled wish that they're having, or they'd find a different way of committing suicide. But it also shows how easy it could be for those states which have ready access to guns to reduce their suicide rates. There's also surprising impact of taking steps like putting up barriers to prevent suicide, to restricting the number of pills that you can buy at one time. So in the UK, a few years ago now, we switched the number of pills you could buy when you were buying pain relief medication, so you can only buy a relatively small number now. It used to be virtually unregulated. And the suicide rate dropped quite dramatically. The Eiffel Tower, Sydney Harbour Bridge, the Empire State Building have all seen dramatic reductions in the number of suicides by putting up barriers. But what is striking is that these barriers are often not barriers that make it impossible for you to jump off, just make it a bit harder. So in the UK, we have a big cliff that's a popular place for people to jump off. They recently moved the car park so that it was a bit of a longer walk to get there. And there was nearly 20% reduction in the suicide rate from that cliff. There just seemed a bit more time for people to have to get there. It was a bit more effort. But again, it's striking how relatively simple steps can reduce suicide rates. So just to summarize, I think some of the key points I'm trying to make. So the first is that suicide, I think we should see as a societal issue. The rates of suicide, who is committing suicide, yes, it is a private story and a private tragedy, but it also tells us much about what kind of society we have. There was a tragic case recently in the UK where somebody jumped off a building. People got out their phones, not to call for an ambulance, but to photograph the person as they were dying. I think we need to shift to see we don't have to have the suicide rates that we have. We could have much lower ones. Some countries have been very effective. Detroit in the US has recently sought to introduce zero suicide policy, and they're actively trying to get, and they're very close to getting a zero suicide rate by really making this a major political priority in properly funded helplines, putting up barriers and so forth, funding mental health, and they've made it a major goal for their particular city, and other places could do the same. Secondly, I've argued that it's very rare for someone to have full capacity or autonomy when they're committing suicide. They're often mistaken about the reality of the situation they're in. It's often an impulsive decision. It's often one where they feel they've got no choice, that they're not making a free choice. And in fact, therefore, if we're really interested in respecting autonomy, we should be listening to the voice of the persons they normally are, not at this moment of crisis that they're in. But their normal self will be saying that they want to live. Next, I've tried to argue that we need to see that the state has a responsibility for suicide rates. It's our policies on regulation of internet content. It's our policies towards people who are immigrants, people in the LGBT community, our policies towards prisoners that are affecting the suicide rate. We all have a responsibility for the rates of suicide within our community. And finally, I realize there are really difficult issues around euthanasia and end-of-life care for people with painful issues. But I think that debate, difficult as it is, has taken up so much time and energy, has been so debated by philosophers. There's so many books written on it. But we've actually lost sight of what's, I think, a more prevalent, in a sense, certainly it's a more prevalent issue, involves many more people, and that's the issue of suicide. And so I hope, if nothing else, I've encouraged you to think a little bit more about the typical average suicide and how we might use the law and the provisions of the state to try and reduce suicide rates and to protect people from suicide. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Herring, for, in first place, for two things. To formulate certainly an hidden problem that because we are discussing always euthanasia, and we forgot this big problem of our societies. And so, second, because you formulate issues of rights, new conceptions of right and responsibility of the groups, the schools also, the societies, the families, but above all, the societies and the states. And therefore, we study your method that is so human, good method, good methodology. We can think about the big abstract issues that normally in the law and philosophy and psychology we discuss. The problem of autonomy, the big issue of what is autonomy, what is the sense of life, and these big issues we can only discuss when we have a good basis. And you gave us a very important way of thinking about those problems. I will open the questions to the colleagues or the public, and the floor is of the public in this moment. Please put your questions.
You talked about the state having compassion, and my question is, isn't it like the main problem, or more in the solution, like that the people that want to commit suicide they need a friendship, a family. Like, how can the state help in this? Because for me, like the first question would be, can the state himself have compassion?
I think that's a fantastic question. Thank you very much. And you're right. I think often what's most needed there is friendship, a companion with you. And I've been doing a different project I've been working on that's been looking at loneliness. And I think you're quite right. A major problem in our society is loneliness. There's some work I'm looking at, which is trying to explore the idea that there might be some kind of right to social interaction, that someone who is living a life where they're utterly isolated from other people, that's actually some sort of a breach of their rights. Now, it's difficult then to formulate what the state should be doing, but I think there is much more the state can be doing to encourage social interaction. Perhaps it used to be the way society works, you could just assume people would organize themselves into social groups. But perhaps now we do need more to be done to enable groups of people to meet together. That so much of our public spaces have become sort of privatized or inaccessible. And certainly there are groups, for example, people who with disabilities, older people who are particularly likely to be isolated and alone. And our society doesn't make many of our public spaces accessible to older people and disabled people. Just to give one example, this is a trivial, perhaps a silly example in a way, but in a way it's a really important issue, and that's public toilets. That many older people and disabled people might find it difficult to go out because there's no ready place to go to public toilets. And that's just one example of trying to think about what's keeping people in their home. Are there ways that we can promote social interaction? Because I think loneliness, loss of friends, loss of companions is a major problem in our society. And I think it seems people aren't able to sort it out themselves. We do need the state to come in to try and find creative ways of enabling interaction.
Other questions?
Thank you, Professor, for your lecture. You said that the case for autonomy is a problematic one because maybe the decision to commit suicide it may not come from the real self of the person, because for a long time he doesn't want to commit suicide, suddenly he wants to, and maybe that's not a real decision from him. But that presupposes some kind of evaluation of which one is the real self, which we are assuming, and is a problematic one, because if the person just comes and says something like, who are you to decide which one is my real self, because I am the one living here in this body and in this mind, so perhaps this one is my decision now, and this as true and as real as the other ones I had the last week or something like that. So this one deserves as much respect as the one from last week. So I'm not defending necessarily that this is the best answer. I'm just asking how shall we respond to this answer he gives us. Thank you.
Right. Thank you. That's an excellent question. You're quite right. It's not an easy one. How do we know which is the real person? So the Rabone case, I was assuming that the real Ms. Rabone was when she was happy and healthy. But why not say, well, it's when she's deeply depressed and wanting to commit suicide? That's the real her. I think I'll give two answers. I think so. So one is a question of time. So what is the general state that the person is feeling? So is this just a momentary moment of despair, or is this a long-term decision? So in English law, one of the big cases we had on euthanasia was a man with locked-in syndrome, which essentially meant he couldn't move. It was very difficult for him to interact with the outside world. He'd had that condition for several years. He'd spent a lot of time thinking about it and had reached the decision that he wanted to die. And that was a consistent decision he'd always held. That to me looks like one of the rare cases of an autonomous decision, because it was consistent over time. He knew fully the basis of the decision. Many suicides, however, are just an impulsive moment. And I think in answer to your question as well, I'd just add the high rates of gratitude that people who have been stopped committing from suicide express, and how rare it is for them to go on to try a second time. And those two facts both to me suggest that that was a temporary feeling that they were having, that it didn't reflect a long-term part of their character, their true self, or else we'd see much higher rates of repeated suicide, and we'd have people being angry that they were being stopped from committing suicide, which very occasionally happens, but is very, very rare.
Okay, thank you. May I raise another question?
Yeah.
About the lack of lucidity or something like that, because sometimes when people say, "Oh, nobody loves me," or "I have no future perspective," and you said lots of times that is wrong, they are mistaken, and so on. But let's just admit that it is wrong. But next week he will think it again. He is shown, he is proven wrong, but next week he thinks it again. And what kind of responsibility does the state have here? Must the state be always correcting his interpretation of reality every day, every week, or every month? He must remember something kind of the inverse of what the Romans allegedly did in the past. Memento mori, remember you must die. And here, remember you must not die. You don't have to die, because in fact you are wrong. There are, what kind of responsibility, how far goes the responsibility of the state?
Yeah, and of course you're absolutely right. There have to be limits. We couldn't possibly have the state following, I don't know, a police officer following everybody who seemed a bit unhappy. That would clearly be impossible. We just haven't got the resources to do that. And so clearly there are limits here, that the resources will have to focus on those who have been persistently suicidal, and where there is that real and immediate risk of suicide. And even there are limits. You can't watch somebody 24 hours a day normally. So we can do what is reasonable and what we can. I think in your example, we can do what we can to encourage them to see the good things in life, and to open their eyes to all that there is to enjoy.
Following my colleague's first question, I would like to know how the future self can be relevant in this matter, because you both talked about several selves, but one of the selves that you mentioned was the future self. So there are several selves in my past and in my present, but the future self doesn't exist exactly. So how do you build the relevance of a future self to build an autonomy judgment in the present?
So let me use this to answer that question. Let me use a slightly different scenario. Let's say we've got someone who's ill, and if they don't receive treatment, they're going to become very seriously disabled and in terrible pain. But they say, no, I don't. Let's say they've got to have an injection. They say, no, I don't like needles. I won't have the injection. And so we don't give them the injection. They become seriously disabled and in terrible pain. That person then might turn to their doctors and say, why didn't you give me that injection? I'm now suffering terrible pain And you could have just forced me to have the injection, and I wouldn't have this disability, I wouldn't be in this pain. And our answer to them would be, well, that was your autonomous decision. You told us you didn't want the injection, so we let you be. That's why we let you fall into this terrible state. Now, that autonomy argument might give you a good reason for not giving the injection, but only if it was a really richly thought through decision. Otherwise, I think you as a doctor would have a lot of responsibility why you left your patient to suffer terrible pain. And relying on a very weak kind of autonomy, one that was based on an irrational fear or a lack of understanding of the facts, is not a sufficient reason. So it's the idea that we have responsibilities to others. We have responsibilities to try and protect each other from harm. Now, sometimes we have to let people harm themselves if that is a fully, richly autonomous decision. So that's, I think, where I'd bring in the future person. The future person, if you like, asking us, well, why didn't you stop me? Or in the context of today's talk, why, perhaps the relatives, why did you let that person die? Well, we're going to say, well, we could have stopped them, but it was their autonomous wish. And my argument is that's only a good argument if that autonomy is a really rich kind of autonomy.
So if I understand you correctly, your argument also completely changes the right to refuse treatment. The right to refuse a medical treatment.
In this sense, that you have the right to refuse medical treatment if you are autonomous, and where the decision is going to leave you in terrible pain and with a serious disability or something like that, it would have to be a really richly autonomous decision. So it's not denying that there is a right to refuse treatment, but it's emphasizing it's only the right if you've got autonomy, and where it's going to leave you in a serious pain, it's going to have to be a rich kind of autonomy.
Okay, thank you.
Other question?
Well, first of all, thank you for the lecture, Professor. My question also comes in hand with this last questions. And my question is, how can we properly acknowledge, if it is that we can, that a person has its full capacity at the moment or at the previous moment of committing suicide? How can we do it? And what is the moment that we should have as a statement to acknowledge if there is a full capacity in that person?
Yeah, and you're right. So there'll be some cases where you simply don't know. So you see someone running towards a cliff and they're going to jump off, and you can stop them, but you don't have time to, as they're running along, check whether or not they have capacity. And so I think there someone would have to make an immediate assessment. And I think for the reasons I've given, generally people committing suicide don't lack capacity. And I think that would therefore be a fair assumption. It might be, if it's a very rare case where someone has made a fully autonomous decision and it's their doctor, that they will know them well enough to be able to make an assessment. I know this patient, I know what they've been going through, they've really thought about this carefully, and so I'm not going to try and stop them because I know they've got capacity. But I suppose that would be a rare kind of case.
So we should have the presumption that usually they lack of capacity.
That is correct.
Okay, yeah. Thank you.
Está aqui outra.
Thank you very much, Professor. I'm enjoying this debate also. So I want to go to what we were talking about of the criteria of time, because you talked that the most of people commit suicides by a compulsive act. But when we are talking about the the people with problem of depression. This is a decision that and it is a disease that during a lot of time, and it is a decision that they have to feel that they are not useful and that they want to die during a long term. So seeing the data, how can we say that there is a link between capacity, time, and mental health? And the other question about we're talking about the responsibility of the state to care about this duty. How can we see this duty extraterritorial in an extraterritorial view? Because we recently I read in a newspaper that in Switzerland there is like a machine where people commit suicide, and they build a machine to people to go there and put on the button, and they decide to die. And there is a lot of problems in if it is a correct way to decide to commit suicide that is not punished in that country.
So on your first question, which is an excellent question and is a very difficult issue, I agree. So the first point I'd make is, of course, as I'm sure you know, depression comes in all sorts of different forms and different ways. So there are some cases like the Ms. Rabone case I was talking about, where someone is normally happy and just has moments of intense depression. Other people can have depression but perfectly happy to live with it. Sometimes it's, as you were indicating, a long-term condition. I think our primary duty in relation to depression must be to give people what treatment and help they can. And I think probably as a society, we have for too long not been taking depression as a health issue and a social issue that needs to be taken very seriously and addressing. I think simply allowing people with depression, oh, well, you should, if you want to commit suicide, we'll respect that, is to fail to give them the treatment they need, which will be the treatments all take a long time. That said, I can imagine a case with someone with very long-term depression who has tried all sorts of different kinds of treatments, none of them have worked, and they reach a conclusion then that they want to die, that might be a sufficiently autonomous decision. But I think in many cases, it's a case that someone with treatment will come to be able to live with the depression or even to overcome it. But I think simply saying, oh, if someone's depressed and wants to commit suicide, let them do so, is to fail to treat depression as an illness to which people have a right to receive appropriate treatment.
I agree, but from the perspective of the doctor, it is really difficult to see if there is hope, and in the next treatment, the people will turn out that decision, or if we have to respect that decision, you know, how to say if it is really a disease problem or an autonomous problem.
That's right. I think there is always that question with, I mean, it comes up with anorexia nervosa, for example, whether or not the person who's not wanting to eat and taking calories, is that the disease speaking, as some of the English judges have said, the person who doesn't want to eat, that's not them speaking, that's the disease speaking. And you get a similar issue, I think, is this the depression speaking or is this the individual? And I think it does turn then on a matter of time. So there comes a point in which the depression has been lasting for such a long time that it is who they are, that they are this depressed individual. As I said earlier, some people are perfectly able to live good and happy lives with that. But there might be some cases where someone can't. And I agree, it's not going to be easy to draw a line. On your extraterritorial issue, I saw that story too, and it's fascinating. Of course, there's limits upon what the state can do to stop people traveling overseas in these kinds of cases. I mean, I think we can try and warn people of the dangers, certainly try and restrict advertising on it. But at the end of the day, if someone's that determined, there's not much we can do about it.
Martha, please, Martha. Yeah. Yes.
I would like to thank you for this lecture. I think it was really important because we had the opportunity to think about the life that is worth living and not only about death, that is what happens in most of the times. So I have two questions. And the first one is, when or let's put in a time chronogram, but when the state obligations start in creating this right to be protected from suicide. It starts in public investments, in health services, in policies, migrants policies, in taking care that other rights are being protected, or it starts after, let's imagine, the first suicide attempt. Because what happens in Portugal is that when you have a first suicide attempt, you are guided by a psychiatrist, and the pills you can take are reduced that you can buy. But it's only after the first attempt. So I think that your idea has to do with conditions of life and the protection of other rights that creates a life that is worth living. Mm-hmm. And the second question is, if we follow this idea, is allowing suicide, if the state allows assisted suicide, it is a kind, do you think it is a kind of way of the state to deny its obligations in others first?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, I think in answer to your first question, it's a really good point. I think if we were to say, we recognize suicide as a major social problem, and we as a community, as a government, want to try and do all we can to stop it, it's going to impact on all sorts of different areas of life. As we were saying earlier, trying to combat loneliness, as well as some of the issues you were mentioning. So it could become influence all sorts of areas of policy. But I think the first step is to recognize this is a social problem. Our society, we would like a society in which there is a zero or at least very low suicide rate. On your second question in relation to euthanasia, what worries me particularly is the language of there being a right to die. And I think that's a really dangerous concept given the prevalence of suicide. So our starting point being you have a right to die is not the right place. I'm not utterly opposed to there being euthanasia. My own preference would be, and I don't know how this would work in Portuguese law, but in English criminal law, we have a defense called necessity, which is available for very unusual circumstances. That's something very unusual has happened. It's appropriate that there be a killing that takes place. And I would like to see euthanasia approved on that basis. So a doctor going to court to say this is a very unusual case, someone like the Mr. Nicholson case I was mentioning, they've had this terrible condition for a long time, they've thought about it, there's no hope of recovery, then they can get it. I think that would capture the idea that euthanasia can be appropriate in exceptional, very unusual cases, rather than some sort of generalized right to die, which I find a very worrying idea.
Thank you.
So a lot of colleagues have first.
Thank you very much, Professor, for being here discussing this so relevant subject with us, first of all. And I would like to ask you if you think there is any legal responsibility of the institutions, for example, schools, university, and even the states, about creating an environment that avoid this kind of things like suicide, which is an extreme decision, or at least don't push an environment that don't push people to go to that way, through that way, you know, because some, as you explained it to us, the military, for example, are the first group that commits suicide. It's so common everywhere in Brazil, in Portugal, in United States, and students are the second group, and it's so how can I say, it's so clear that there is something wrong with this environment, and the institutions, they sometimes don't care about making something to, you know, reduce this kind of issue, at least promoting discussions and helping the students, the militaries, and sometimes, and it's just the way there is, and people go through that way, and they treat like an accident or something, and we say that the cases are growing every day, and we don't see any responsibilization, legal at least.
Yeah. Thank you. No, I think you're absolutely right, and I'm very pleased that Oxford University, my university, have a suicide prevention policy specifically trying to combat rates of suicide amongst our students. I think that partly is greatly improving the availability of counselling and mental health services for students, having helplines available that all through the night for students to call. What we've particularly focused on is a problem that's often identified in schools and universities, which are known as cluster suicides. So this is where one person commits suicide and then others copy what has happened. And the university's done a lot of work on what should happen when a student commits suicide to try and combat that. And we've now got some excellent sets of regimes, so that if a student does commit suicide, there's a large team that now goes in, and a whole set of services that are put in place because of that particular problem. One other issue I'd mention, there was a very sad case in England of a student who was required to give a lecture as part of their course. They had to give a lecture presentation to other students, and this student had a range of different social anxiety issues, which meant they were terrified of that. But the university said, no, you have to give the presentation. And sadly, they killed themselves. And I think after that, there's been a lot of awareness within the university of how we might assume as professors that, oh, giving a talk to someone, that's fine. And yes, people are a bit nervous about it, perhaps not appreciating how social anxiety or other forms of assessment can impact upon people. And so being very alert to trying to find alternative ways of assessment and to take into account different disabilities or challenges that individuals have.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for your talk. My question is a bit similar to the previous questions, but it's about the human right to be protected from suicide as an autonomous right in itself, and what would be the contents of that right? Or if in other words, the state responsibility in judicial terms would always be invoked as a breach of other more broad rights. For example, the right of taking preventive measures such as barriers, or imagine if someone survives from an attempted suicide and decides to sue the state for not taking health measures, for example. And so in a way, this right would be a consequence or be included in much broader fundamental rights that we can find in the Human Rights Convention or in each state's constitution, or if it would be possible, even if created by court decisions, for example, an autonomy to the right to be protected from suicide, and if the content would be even possibly to determinate, meaning that if I, example, or if my family, someone that's been, that attempted suicide and survives can go to a court and say that the state violated my right to be protected from suicide, or if I can only say the state violated my right to have mental health care or have social security care, or the examples you gave, meaning benefits and other kinds of social problems of our society. And so in that way, if it would be the state would be responsible for an omission of care, or if it could be possible even by commission of the death of the person as cause of that omission could be the cause of something. So it's more about the autonomy of that right. Thank you.
Thank you. So yes, it would fall under the general right of Article 2. The right to protection from life, but you're right, it could also bring in elements of Article 8. So in that sense, it's part of a bigger general right, but it's applied in a particular context. So where the European Court have been particularly active is in relation to domestic abuse. So as you may well know, where the state is aware that domestic abuse is occurring and does not put into place effective protections, the state then can be liable for not prosecuting the abuser for leaving the woman normally within the abusive relationship. And there she would be entitled to damages for the state seeking to intervene and protect her. That is a part of the general Article 3 right to protection from torture and inhuman or degrading treatment, and sometimes Article 8. But what the courts have said is that the context of domestic abuse has some very particular features, so that it's well known the victim may withdraw a complaint made to the police, for example, because they are fearful of retaliation from the abuser, or for other reasons. So the context may give a particular reason why the state should take very seriously that particular form of torture. So I think it's a similar point in relation to suicide. It's part of the general Article 2 right to life protection, but it's got a particular kind of context and particular intervention that's necessary. Yes, I think in legal terms, as happened in the Rabone case, her family successfully sued the state for the hospital not adequately protecting her from committing suicide. Damages were awarded. There's a sense, though, I suppose I'm not, my primary motivation for this lecture and my arguments are not really to have lots of litigation being brought by the state, but rather to get the state to recognize its responsibilities and to want to put in place protective measures. But of course, litigation might be necessary as part of that. But yes, I think a claim could be brought because you didn't intervene, my relative committed suicide, or I made a suicide attempt.
There is another colleague that would like to put a question.
Thank you, Professor, for the magnificent lecture, and thank you, Professora Fernanda Palma, for bringing us Professor Jonathan to us. Thank you. It was wonderful to hear you, and I've been studying the right to health, so for me it's very important that the topic here. So will you agree that we should conclude that, first of all, to protect the right to protect suicide is the right to protect, first of all, mental health. So in European Court has stand that through Article 2 to Article 3 to Article 8. So in these cases, Fernando's Oliveira versus Portugal or Ramon versus UK, we need to take further measures to fulfill these rights. So the specific duties and to the specific population are strongly here. So how we establish those public policies, how to reinforce that protection, because if we go through this in these cases in European courts, it's because our courts have failed, like it was quoted that how to protect through judicial courts, but first how to protect by legislative function, by administrative function. What measures should Portugal or UK to strongly adopt to prevent further issues like similar cases it was condemned?
Right. So I think every government should have a suicide prevention plan, which should be a whole set of policies specifically designed to reduce suicide, and we should have targets to try and reduce suicides. I was saying the city of Detroit did. That, as we mentioned earlier, I think is going to involve a whole range of policies on all sorts of areas. It's going to be improving mental health. That certainly in the UK, and I think many countries, mental health has taken very much a sort of secondary role as opposed to physical health. And in many cases, I think we should be seeing suicide as like a case where someone had a medical condition and the doctors just stood by and let the condition get worse and worse and they died from it. And that would be a breach of proper healthcare. So we need to be funding mental health services. There's lots in relation to trying to make it harder to access forms of suicide that can be done. I think a lot can be done with what we were talking about earlier about trying to combat loneliness and in that area, trying to improve conditions of surveillance of prisoners, those in the armed forces with suicidal ideation. And there are just so many different areas and things that can be done.
Protecting the elderly, the students.
Yeah, we mentioned earlier policies at universities.
But in these cases, I'm sorry, it's last question. In these cases, like in hospital facilities, the hospital always argue that how we should act regarding the duty of vigilance. Yeah. What is the extent of the duty of vigilance? Should the national court condemn the state civil liability, penal liability? What is the extent of that duty in a hospital facility?
Inevitably, you must take reasonable steps. That's what the courts have said, and I recognise that's in a way not very clear guidance. As I was saying earlier, I think my wish is not for more litigation. My wish would be for a hospital to say, we don't want anyone in our hospital committing suicide. It's not about a fear of litigation or having to pay damages. That's just what a decent hospital, decent medical profession ought to be doing. It will, of course, depend upon, it just depends on so many individual factors. It's not possible to come up with a sort of one-line answer as to what that will involve or look like. But I hope that any university, college, hospital can sit down and have develop a program, and it'll make mistakes, and I hope we'll learn from mistakes. I was mentioning this one with cluster suicides. Universities more generally recognise this as a particular issue and had to respond to that with a set of targeted interventions. the problem of having to give presentations I was mentioning, and other things will emerge, and it'll be a developing policy. But I think if our starting point is what can we do as an institution, as a society, to reduce suicide rates, keep investigating every suicide that took place. Was there something we could have done? It's getting that kind of mindset that will improve the policies we use. Yes, yes.
Okay, a lot of questions were I see. I would like also to put three questions. A practical question first. All the persons, the colleagues that put the questions have always this necessity to how the law, how the courts could solve those problems. But first of all, we must perhaps think in our system. It's not the common law system. In our system, under Constitution, we can think about an omission, a constitution, violation of Constitution by omission when there is no politics, no law recommending the groups, the institutions, the hospitals, the prisons to have certain procedures to avoid suicide. And that it would be an instrument for us. The legal instrument is very important. It's perhaps more important than in UK because the courts, they don't have such an autonomy. Of thinking. They have autonomy, but thinking they need the law. They need the law. And I think it was a very interesting contribution to. I would retire. I would conclude for you convinced me about a lot of things that perhaps we don't have the law, that the politics, of course, but a law that could give more strong measures to the politics of preventing the homicide. In our system, that would be necessary. And first step, this is only a commentary, but the second is when you put the questions as you put it, we must you understand that the problem of euthanasia, the right to have the death that we would like and to be helped. The problem of euthanasia comes different because you said only as an exception. It is we have a law already. A law that is not completely enacted, but we have a law that and are discussing in Parliament to put completely enacted this law. Only for people that have a big suffering and in extreme cases. But when we see the relationship, the two questions, the question of suicide and the rates of suicide in Portugal are very old, have a very old level. I read 3 suicides per day. It's not good, not good. And in all the world. Then we can see that perhaps the problem of euthanasia, as for example, the problem of abortion, they don't, they must see, they must be conceived not so ideological, but with a context that, for example, when we decriminalize the abortion in certain terms in Portugal, the Constitutional Court, and I was there, has the problem, the Constitutional Court said that it is not necessary to punish if and when we have politics that help to resolve the problem. And this connection is necessary, and in abortion it was done by Constitutional Court, but not everybody is agree, of course. And with the problem of euthanasia, perhaps also this relationship must be done. I agree with you. We don't to authorize to not criminalize the euthanasia not as an homicide depends on something that we must have. Politics and perhaps legal instruments to prevent, to distinguish the situations. But for the courts, there is always this problem. By your criteria, could be your ethical criteria, legal criteria, to distinguish euthanasia, for example, from homicide, and to distinguish euthanasia in these exceptional cases that is approved or not criminalized. And also another crime, we have the crime to helping suicide, to homicide. And when we have only a minor crime that is helping suicide, or when we have in those weak autonomy, in those cases of weak autonomy, we can, in legal terms, in Portuguese law, we could interpret as suicide, or this weak autonomy could give us the idea that the person that helps or instigate, I don't know if we say that, determines the other to commit suicide, is determining the suicide or an homicide. In continental way of thinking, it's not enough as you think in common law.
Yeah.
We have these problems.
Yeah, absolutely. Can I respond with a question, which is, so my arguments were trying to use the European Convention on Human Rights. So how does that work in Portuguese law? Do the courts have to follow what the European Court says?
Not have to follow, the courts follow sometimes, but there is not, it's not specific. Okay.
Because that might be the route in.
Okay.
If this right to protection from suicide is seen as a European Convention obligation.
Yes, we must obey the European Convention, but this is only an interpretation of the European Convention by some, in some cases.
Yes, true.
The problem is how if someone help other person to commit suicide, but this other person is in a weak autonomy, not a strong autonomy, that would be helping suicide or determine the to an homicide.
Yes. So I suppose there, I think the question would turn on the autonomy of the person who
the autonomy is a big question.
We had a very unpleasant case in England where 3 young men had pretended to be friends of a man with learning difficulties, and they were basically making fun of him. They got him to do embarrassing things, and then horribly in the end told him he should kill himself, which he did. And there the court accepted that the man with learning difficulties didn't really know what he was doing. He was just doing what he thought these friends were telling him to do. They weren't.
It was an homicide.
So it could be seen as a homicide.
Okay.
But other cases like that.
But this is an extreme case.
That's an extreme case.
Okay.
Yes. Otherwise, it would be
There is, it's very interesting what your lecture about your arguments, because you are far from the liberal tradition of Hume.
Right, yes, yes, yes. Well,
you are not a liberal.
I wouldn't say that. I have tried to put the argument very much in favor of autonomy and freedom, but it's then a matter of autonomy, which, as we were saying earlier, which person are we going to listen to? Or often someone might have conflicting views. I'd like to live, but only if I didn't have this condition, or I had a different job, or I could find a partner. And it might be then a matter of trying to ascertain, well, what's their real autonomy?
It is a very important problem, not only for suicide,
Yeah,
for all questions like, for example, for abortion.
Yeah.
I'm sorry, I interrupt you. But for example, today we are discussing in Parliament if the counseling or the time, not the counseling, the time to think about the must be not have, we must not have this time, and the counseling. I think the counseling is very important, but in Portugal today there is the left part of Parliament is against the counseling in abortion, and the problem of counseling is the same in suicide. Is okay, we can say in abortion there is not only the life of the person, but the life of the future person. But this problem of there is always the problem of the paternalism. I don't know if you say that in paternalism. And some institutions, when they give counsels, they project ideology.
Yes.
That is really also a problem.
Yes. Absolutely. And I think that certainly in that context, that's a real problem in developing what would be neutral counselling. And few people have neutral views on abortion, for example, and so it can be difficult to it can be difficult to give it. But I think we always have to remember, I think, in relation to sort of paternalism, for example, that yes, it's in one way it's a terrible thing to say to someone, right, we're going to stop you doing something that you want, because otherwise you're going to end up in a terrible place. That's paternalism. Many people don't like that. But on the other hand, it's a terrible thing for someone to end up, as I was saying earlier, in terrible pain or in a position they didn't want to be, because somebody listened to their views that were not genuinely their own views. And so if we end up in a situation where we're utterly miserable, our family are miserable, and we turn to our friends and say, well, why didn't you stop me? And they say, oh, well, you said you were happy to do that. I think we can turn around and say, but you should have seen I was very confused when I said that. What sort of friend stands by and lets someone cause themselves and their family and others terrible harm? Maybe if it was a really richless autonomous decision, that's a good enough reason to stand by. But we're betraying people and betraying our friends to allow them to get into terrible situations based on what was obviously a confused or weak expression of autonomy.
But for legal applying, I think we can only reach a negative criteria. To deny in extreme case that there is no autonomy, but a positive content to autonomy to function in legal decisions is very, very difficult.
Yeah, so it's easier, I suppose, where there's a clear duty to act. So where you've got a doctor, for example, or a police officer, or someone who's in a professional capacity who has then a duty, legal duty to be protecting citizens, for protecting patients. then it's easier to find, I think, the legal duty to act.
Yes. But to define positive criteria to legal applying is very, very difficult. And I don't think that the judge could be prepared because they must see to have an ethical understanding of the things, not only legal, but ethical understanding of things, perhaps in future. But I think that the framework you gave us could help us to think in continental law, that in civil law, that perhaps there is a space between the legal formulas and the politicals, that perhaps an ethical or soft law or something that in universities we must think about that. How can we translate in a legal way of thinking and in legal formulas those ideas, and how to understand the problem, like euthanasia, not only as an ideological problem, because it is an ideological problem, but not only an ideological problem. When 3 persons per day commit suicide in Portugal, then we must, when we are thinking about euthanasia, we must think about that also. Thank you very much for your magnificent lecture, and I think everybody learned about this subject and other subjects. Thank you very much.
And thank you for the